Welcome to The Steward, MSD's podcast dedicated to exploring the critical fields of antimicrobial stewardship and infection control. I'm your host, Holly Smith, from the Policy and Communications team at MSD in the UK. Through the series, we'll engage with a diverse range of experts to discuss their insights and experiences with antimicrobial resistance and how this can be translated into effective antimicrobial stewardship across the UK. As a reminder, all contributions by experts, their comments, factual claims or otherwise, are based on their own experiences and have not been influenced by MSD, nor do they represent the views of MSD. Now, let's get started. Today, Professor William Gaze will be joining us on the podcast to explore the connections between the environment and antimicrobial resistance, commonly known as AMR. This includes exploring whether the environmental dimensions are discussed and prioritised appropriately in how we monitor and take action to reduce the threat of antimicrobial resistance. Professor William Gaze is a Professor of Microbiology at the European Centre of Environmental and Human Health, which is part of University of Exeter's Medical School. He leads a large research group focusing on the environmental dimension of AMR, including the evolution of resistance in complex microbial communities found in humans, animals, and the environment. Welcome, Will. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
It's a pleasure. It's really nice to be here.
What really brought you into the antimicrobial resistance or stewardship space?
Yeah, it's quite a long and convoluted story if we go right back to the beginning. So I'm actually an environmental scientist. I did marine biology as my first degree. And actually we don't really, in those days, maybe that was in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, that we didn't really learn that much about microbial systems other than they sort of underpinned microbial food webs and ecosystems. But actually as I've gone through my sort of career in biological sciences, it becomes clear that microbes underpin all sort of ecological systems. We have our complex microbial communities within us, the human microbiome, and we know that planetary cycles are driven by microbial processes. So actually, it becomes increasingly clear that life on Earth, when we think about human health all the way through to the health of the environment, is dependent on, in many ways, on microbial systems. So I actually started off working in parasitology, and then worked on protozoology, which is looking at single-celled organisms, not bacteria, but more similar to animals and plants, like amoebae and ciliates and things like that. And then there's a really interesting field looking at bacterial pathogens of those single-celled eukaryotic cells, like amoebae. So how bacteria evolved pathogenicity in the first place. And at about that time, so we're talking about 25 years ago, antimicrobial resistance, it was already a big issue, but this environmental dimension of antimicrobial resistance was receiving more attention. Still relatively little compared to the clinical picture, but it was at that point really that I started to work with colleagues that were trying to link what we knew about environmental microbial systems with the sort of the human health perspective. And in the context of antimicrobial resistance specifically, we know that antibiotics are in many cases natural products that have come from environmental microorganisms. Penicillin is produced naturally by fungus. But what many people don't realise is that antibiotic resistance as well is a natural phenomenon, and has evolved in environmental bacteria over what we think is actually millions or billions of years. And because of the intricacies of microbial genetics and the way that they can exchange genetic material even between completely unrelated species, it's really now becoming evident that many of these resistance mechanisms we see in clinical pathogens, in human pathogens, have come from environmental bacteria. And then we get into all the sort of the environmental roles in transmission and the rest of it. So it's really become quite clear that we need to think about AMR, particularly when we're talking about antibacterial resistance or antibiotic resistance, in this sort of more integrated way.
Fabulous, thank you. What an answer, and what an opening for the episode, I think. So moving into antibiotic resistance and the environment, I've recently read, and I'm sure most of our audience would have read or at least seen in the news, that there's growing concern over antimicrobial resistance in England's and the UK's national parks, particularly in rivers that are polluted with drug-resistant bacteria. So starting kind of zooming completely out here, can you start by explaining how antimicrobial resistant bacteria could end up in our natural water bodies and the impacts that that could have before we go into some more of the details?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, that work that you're referring to in the antimicrobials or the pharmaceutical residues themselves that human use is leading to measurable quantities of those in the environment. So that's done by a colleague of mine in the University of York, Alistair Boxall, and that's really fascinating. We really haven't appreciated that the antibiotics that humans use in clinical medicine and also industrial agriculture, they go into the wastewater system and then through into the environment. Wastewater treatment's not designed to remove antimicrobial or pharmaceutical residues, so some are removed, but some end up in the environment. And that's one strand of work that we focus on, is at what concentrations are those antibiotics still active or can contribute to further development of resistance. When we consider the sort of the environmental or aquatic reservoirs of antibiotics and resistant bacteria themselves, we have to remember that the natural environment is a reservoir of resistance, as well as a sink of resistance that comes from humans and animals. So you get this sort of potential for mixing of bacteria with these mobile resistance mechanisms that come from humans, animals, and environmental sources. And now, of course, we're learning that can be in the presence of concentrations of antibiotics that are high enough to drive further resistance or have the potential to do that. So this is quite a new and emerging area of research on antimicrobial resistance. But we also have to think about, where did those resistance mechanisms come from in the first place? So we know that we've seen these wave after wave of resistance mechanisms sort of forming what are actually multiple global pandemics. And those resistance mechanisms have come from the natural environment, even if they're selected for, or the enrichment of them is being driven by human usage. But then this additional question is, well, so what about all these excreted antibiotics that enter the environment? What are they doing? Are they contributing significantly to this overall emergence of resistance? And that's the type of research that we're focusing on at the moment.
So where the resistant mechanisms come from in the first place, how does understanding those resistant mechanisms and understanding where they do come from, how does that help us in addressing the antimicrobial resistance threat going forward?
I think it helps because just by understanding that fact, it sort of broadens the focus away from just thinking about what's going on in humans, and specifically in, say, intensive care units, where of course the effects of antimicrobial resistance infections are most keenly felt. But if you don't really understand, or that resistance is coming in from outside, that of the human microbiome, if you like, then perhaps that doesn't help prioritize additional mitigations which can help to reduce that flow of resistance. So what we need to do is reduce the rates at which resistance arises to these antibiotics that are still working, including completely new antibiotics for which no resistance is currently known. So if that flow of resistance that's coming in from outside of the sort of the human sphere is not considered, and we're only thinking about what's going on, within humans and within healthcare settings, we may overlook the fact that things like good sanitation and hygiene in that broader sense, and this linkage between the environmental and animal and human microbiome, which is important. We may ignore that. I did also allude to the fact that there are new antibiotics coming, not so many as we would like, but we need to preserve those for as long as we can. So understanding whether there are resistance mechanisms in environmental bacteria to those new antibiotics, and then ensuring that there are ways to slow that movement of resistance mechanisms from environment or animals to humans is a key part of the sort of reducing the rate at which resistance arises.
Excellent, thank you. So it's really more around being proactive rather than reactive, what is obviously kind of the approach in human health, especially at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's exactly right. So I think, I've spoken to clinicians who say, well, how does this help me, understanding this when I have someone in front of me who might have sepsis, and that bacterium that's causing that infection is already resistant. And that is a really good point. And, it may be that there's not so much that can be done at that point. But what we need to do is slow the rate at which that scenario or situation happens. It's a more long-term proactive approach than actually is afforded to the people in the clinical sphere who have to make those life and death decisions, over periods of hours or days.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, that the aim is to then have less people getting resistant infections, which ultimately will also help the healthcare exactly. System and that burden.
I think, One Health is a really important concept, but actually I think different groups of people understand it in slightly different ways. And there is, of course, a danger inherent in the One Health approach, is that we immediately divide things up into human, animal, and environmental sort of sectors. People say, well, human health, animal health, environmental health. Really, it's all about human health in many ways in the context of antimicrobial resistance specifically. So I think it's the One Health idea is really just about considering all of these interconnections, defining what they are. They're not always relevant to everyone. If you're, as I said before, if you're an intensive care clinician, these things become secondary. But in terms of, from a public health perspective, in preventing infections and reducing the rates at which resistance arises in the human microbiome and human pathogens, I think it's a key part of it.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the ways how we can work together, I think, work across, you mentioned the quadripartite earlier. So that's where the WHO works, the World Health Organization works with the likes of the World Organization for Animal Health or the EN Environment Programme. And I think it's a neat way where organizations that maybe typically would be siloed or work separately can finally work together on a topic like antimicrobial resistance to try and come up with some solutions across the whole piece.
And that is one of the really, exciting things and positive things that has happened in the last decade, for example, or even the last 5 years or so. Perhaps, in the UK, really sort of going from the last National Action Plan, not the current one, so 2019. Mm-hmm. So that's even the last 5 years, we can see how there is much better communication across these different sort of areas of government and of science that we consider to be part of this One Health, communication that's so important. Were taking a UK-centric or an English-centric perspective, were people from the equivalent, the UK Health Security Agency and Animal Plant Health Agency and Environment Agency talking to each other about AMR and antibiotic resistance specifically, maybe they were just beginning to, but really we can see that has transformed in the last 5 years. So I think at every level in communication and in policy documents and potentially emerging policy and regulation, we can see that this integration is improving. There's still some way to go, and many AMR narratives, this One Health sort of perspective is actually pretty still ignored. Or after everything, someone might say, well, and we have to consider the One Health perspective, and it's important to do so. But what they don't articulate, which I guess is what we're trying to talk about today, is why that's important.
We spoke previously, and when we spoke, you discussed antimicrobial resistance as a planetary health issue, particularly when we think of it in relation to climate change, land use change, pollutions and waterways, for example, some of the topics we've had. So would you be able to define what you mean by antimicrobial resistance being a planetary health issue?
Yeah. Okay. So now we're getting sort of almost expanding out even from the One Health ideas, because planetary health, I suppose, is this idea that humans require a healthy environment across all these different sectors or issues, as you mentioned previously, to support a thriving human population. And we know, in fact, planetary health is basically the idea that many of the resources that we rely on for our health and the health of societies, those metrics of those resources are increasingly decreasing. So they are decreasing, relatively rapidly. So we know, for example, that biodiversity loss is increasing, and of course, what many people don't consider is that microbial diversity is, of course, part of biodiversity, but because it's invisible, we don't really consider it. Also, as part of planetary health ideas, we think about climate change as well, and how that's impacting the natural environments and the resources on which we rely. We know that increased food production is a major driver of land system change, and that may include spreading manure waste and biosolids from human feces onto land as part of circular economy and things like that. And it's about freshwater use. It's also about biogeochemical flows, which might include some of those organic wastes that we were talking about before, which can be implicated in transmission. And so I think that actually you can see that the planetary boundaries that have been suggested, which include those that I've just mentioned, but also things like ocean acidification and atmospheric aerosol loadings and ozone depletion. A significant number of those, you can see that they have a relevance to antimicrobial resistance. And so it invites us to think more about antimicrobial resistance, in humans, animals, and environment, but actually it gives some sort of mechanistic underpinning to those processes and how they might be contributing to the overall problem. It is quite difficult to articulate in a sort of a short period of time. But I think it really just is a continuation of inviting us to think about the world in a joined up way, and actually how degrading natural environments, with pollutants such as man-made antibiotics, has potential to drive that emergence of resistance that I was talking about previously.
Brilliant. And then I guess understanding some of the ways that the resistance emerges there. Are there some key strategies that have been identified that could help mitigate the spread of resistance across that planetary health kind of perspective?
Antimicrobial resistance is really, you can distill it down to, it's about transmission between those three compartments, and it's about amplification or enrichment or selection or whatever what you want to call it within those three. So you can actually think of it in a very simplistic way, and we know that antibiotic usage in humans is amplifying resistance within the human compartment, But what we might not quite realise that also because of these residues and this linkage through pollution, that's potentially also enriching resistance within natural environments. And again, One Health talks about animal health, but we focus on antibiotic usage in animals, not only because we're concerned that resistant animal pathogens will cause infections in animals, it's because we're concerned that the 70% of antibiotics that are used globally, that are used in livestock production, is that their use is amplifying or enriching resistance within animals and livestock, which then potentially spread to humans. So it's almost like you can't if you just cut off humans on their own and just consider, that part of the puzzle, are we then ignoring this potentially major drivers of resistance? So, and the more that we recognise the importance of those interconnections, the more effort and the more resources will be brought to bear on reducing enrichment and transmission from environment to animals and from animals to humans, or any permutation of those things. So I think it's just actually a lot of it is about communicating to people that you do need a more integrated perspective, and that of course we know it's hugely important, the clinical focus, of course it is, but we also need to just consider that it doesn't stand alone. And of course this is nothing new really. We've known these things for many years. I was actually born in 1969. So I'm 55 this year, and that in 1969 is when the Swan report was published by the UK government, and the conclusion of that report was that it wasn't a good idea to use antimicrobials and antibiotics in livestock production because of the risk of amplification of resistance in animal-associated bacteria, which would then spread to humans. But at that time, and in preceding years after, in the 1970s, it was still being said that more data was needed, more evidence was needed. But on some level, it's rather disheartening to think that we're still actually more or less discussing the same things 50 years later, and still saying that we need more evidence, even though we have generated huge amounts of evidence in those intervening years. So that then invites us to think, well, what can we do now? Do we need to ensure that we act based on what we know, or do we keep calling for further evidence? I mean, we always need more evidence, but actually, as we know with climate change, and there are these parallels between climate change policy and AMR policy, as well as being these mechanistic interconnections. What can we learn of how we can best, act now with the information that we know? So I guess this is rather circular, but I think that it does invite us looking at the history of One Health, and also the history of how we have dealt with AMR in the past, about how we translate that to action now and in the future.
Have you mentioned as well there climate change and maybe some of those interconnections with resistance? And this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's really useful for the audience to understand, what would you say, or how would you explain the intricacies and the relationship between climate change and antimicrobial resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is off topic, and there is there's actually quite a lot of interest in these linkages and interconnections. We know that climate change can be some sort of amplifier for many of the problems that we face. That's right. Why would it affect antimicrobial resistance? Well, I think we can look at studies of or global studies of AMR data, and we know that temperature has a sort of an independent association with infection. Of course, many of the parts of the world that are warmer also have other contributing factors as well, such as less investment in sanitation, whatever. But there was a seminal study in the United States. I think it was in 2000. 18, I think, by someone called McFadden. And they basically, that study suggested that there's a longitudinal effect within the US, that as you come south, that if you control for everything else, that these higher temperatures are associated with higher levels of resistant infection. So there's a temperature effect. We know that these mechanisms that bacteria use to exchange genetic material, including antibiotic resistance mechanisms, can be affected by temperature. We know that some human pathogens, which don't grow at very low temperatures, are even able to grow in particular environments at elevated temperatures. We know that transmission from sewage, human sewage, is a major driver of transmission. So if you go back to food, we're seeing more wastewater being used for irrigation, so sort of grey water reuse that has potential links as well. So actually, that's one of the things that at University of Exeter that we're really focusing on are these interlinkages between AMR and climate change, as well as other environmental change issues such as environmental pollution. And what's even more interesting in a way, or alarming, is that there may be even a more intricate relationship and a bidirectional relationship between antimicrobial use and AMR and climate change. For example, we know that animals that are fed antibiotics can, particularly like cattle, they produce more methane, in some studies have suggested. And we also know that antimicrobial pollution in the environment can impact bacteria that are involved in things like nitrogen cycling. And of course, nitrogen gases are also potent greenhouse gases. So, climate change also impacts microbial communities in soils as well, and that can decrease diversity and affect all these geoplanetary cycles, methane cycling, nitrogen cycling. So it's not AMR itself that may be linked to climate change, but antimicrobial use, because this is all sort of theoretical, really, because we have exemplars of where we know that there may be potential issues, but this is still something that really needs to be investigated in more detail. There may well be these bidirectional links between climate change and AMR, and that's something that we may not have thought about, only 5 years ago.
Yeah, fabulous. And I guess thinking about that climate change threat and then the impact that it can have on resistance, as you say, where we see maybe some more resistance in warmer temperatures. Have you heard of anything that we can do to really stop or break down that relationship? Is it something that maybe our governments across the world will need to plan for, as inevitably world temperatures will increase?
I suppose it's another risk associated with climate change. I mean, some of these things are very difficult to mitigate, aren't they? Or maybe we have to think about how we adapt to them rather than mitigate. I mean, just going back to the climate change thing, of course, there are things like, we know that climate change is a major driver of global migration, for example, which again is associated with infectious disease movements, and things like that. And of course, climate change is exerting a lot of stresses on humans and animals and ecosystems. So it's another potentiating factor when we consider these antimicrobial pollution and things like that as well. But yeah, I mean, going back to how we address these, I mean, in the first instance, I suppose we're trying to understand the linkages, and once we do understand them, we can signpost, to decision makers that that wastewater pollution or sewage pollution is likely to increase in the future. So that's another driver for investment in capacity or new treatment technologies, or I mean, again, some of this is quite a sort of high income country perspective, but again, on every level, I think it strengthens the case for investment in things that we need to invest in anyway. But you can if you can quantify, or the the risks that are associated with AMR. That's just another part of what is a very complex picture.
And there, I guess you mentioned around strengthening the case for investment. You also earlier talked about some of your work that you might do with the government, for example, in understanding, maybe taking action against antimicrobial resistance. You'll know that for the first time this year, when the National Action Plan was released, they had a nice link between that One Health approach. And perhaps they had that also in the previous National Action Plan, but I think this year they've pulled that out perhaps even further. Do you think that there's maybe anything more that we could do, and from a UK perspective, in taking action against the antimicrobial resistance threat?
I mean, I think we can see that the UK has been quite active in this area, you know, and Professor Dame Sally Davies has been an amazing figurehead and advocate, you know, on a global stage for this, you know. We can see that, you know, in the recent UN General Assembly high-level meeting, that there have been some commitments, you know, to address AMR from multiple different directions. You know, including a call, which I think is one of Dame Sally Davies's major calls, is for some type of similar organisation like the IPCC, but for antimicrobial resistance. I think actually some funds have been allocated from several countries, including the United Kingdom, to look into that as something that could again strengthen this sort of you know, cross-sectoral response to AMR.
That's it. And the IPCC is a international group, isn't it, across climate change?
That's right, yes.
This has been absolutely brilliant, and thank you so much for your time today. There was a huge amount covered. I think we could have talked a lot more and gone into a lot more detail, but I do really appreciate your thoughts across the topics that we've covered today. One final question that I would love you to answer, please, Will, is what if you could provide the audience with a key message to maybe take away from this discussion or from this podcast, what would that be?
I think potentially it's that, you know, we tend to think that antibiotic resistance is something that happens to other people, you know, resistant infections are other people's business, you know. But we probably all know actually people that have suffered from resistant infections, or even died or been made extremely ill by them. But it's sort of something that we externalize maybe as it's a clinical problem, nothing really much to do with us. But actually, if you do take that sort of broader One Health perspective, then it starts to be a little bit more about what individuals are doing as well. So, you know, we're all consumers. We consume food that is produced with antimicrobials, you know, antifungals as well, you know, as well as antibiotics. And antifungal resistance is in some ways even more alarming because we have so less antifungal drugs, you know, compared to antibiotics. So, you know, we can make decisions in our life that are associated with this. You know, we all know that we shouldn't be pressurizing our GP for antibiotics, you know, particularly when we might just have a virus. And we don't really think there's a cost to us. But actually, every time we take an antibiotic, in some way, we are impacting our own microbiomes, and we're potentially enriching resistance within our own microbiomes. So that's one thing. You know, every time we use an antimicrobial product in the home, you know, that also exerts a pressure for increasing resistance. You know, where we buy our food from, where that's produced, how it's produced, you know, and that gets back to sort of these global trade, you know, and things. You know, even things like rice, you know, antibiotics are used widely in rice production. If you get your Florida orange juice, that's probably had antibiotics sprayed on it. You know, the pork and the chicken, you know, lots of antimicrobials are used. And depending on where that's come from in the world, there will be quite different levels of antimicrobials used, and so the decisions individuals make can, you know, are either contributing or helping to reduce antimicrobial use.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you for joining us today on The Steward. We hope you found this episode insightful and thought-provoking as we explored important topics surrounding antimicrobial stewardship and infection control. We'll be back soon with another episode featuring more experts and fresh insights.